What would you do if the man the whole world called humble, devoted, a fairy tale come true, was secretly building an entire life designed to erase you from it? Not an affair. Not a mistake made in a weak moment. I mean planned. Written down. Signed off by lawyers. Years in the making. I stood beside him at the biggest night of his career, in a dress that cost more than the house I grew up in, smiling for 100 cameras, while a message on his phone told me everything I needed to know about the man I had loved since I was 11 years old. They called him the greatest the sport had ever seen. They called him humble. They called him a self-made billionaire who never forgot where he came from. They never knew what he was willing to forget to become it. My name is Elena. This is not his story. This is mine. And by the end of it, you'll understand exactly what it costs a man to underestimate the woman standing quietly beside him. The night my husband became the richest footballer on earth, I sat alone in a hotel bathroom in Madrid, staring at a phone that wasn't mine, reading 4 words that ended the life I thought I was living. She still doesn't know. I want you to remember that moment, because everything I'm about to tell you started right there, not with a scream, not with a fight, but with silence. The kind of silence that swallows you whole and doesn't let go for a very long time. But to understand how deep that betrayal cut, you have to understand what came before it. You have to understand who I was before I became the wife of. You have to go back with me, all the way back, to a town so small it barely appeared on maps, where the streets smelled of salt and diesel, and a boy with a half-flat football and nothing else in the world used to kick it against my garden wall every single afternoon until his mother called him home for a dinner that was never quite enough. I was 11. He was 12. His name was Raphael, and even then, there was something different about him, a stillness in his eyes that didn't match a boy who came from so little. I used to watch him from my bedroom window, that ball thudding against the wall in the same rhythm, over and over, like a heartbeat he refused to let stop. My father didn't like him at first. "That boy has holes in his shoes," he said once, not unkindly, just as a fact, the way fishermen speak about weather. "His family has nothing, Elena. Don't let your heart get ahead of your sense." But my mother saw something my father didn't. She saw a boy who showed up at our door not out of pity, but out of hunger, not just for food, though there was that too, but hunger for something bigger than the 4 walls he'd been born into. She'd set an extra plate at our table without a word, and Raphael would eat like a boy who didn't know when his next full meal was coming, because he genuinely didn't. I remember the first time I truly saw him, not just as the neighbor boy, but as Raphael. It was the day the Regional Academy Scout came to our town. Word had spread fast in a place that small. Everyone gathered at the dusty pitch behind the church to watch. Raphael was 14, wearing boots 2 sizes too small, stuffed with newspaper so they'd fit, boots that had been his older cousins before him. He scored 4 goals that day. 4. Against boys 2 years older, boys with real boots, boys whose families could afford private coaching. And after the match, I watched the scout pull my mother aside, not his mother, mine, because everyone in town knew whose garden wall he trained against every afternoon, and say, "Your neighbor's boy. He has something. Something rare. Something rare." That's what he was. And somehow, without ever deciding to, I had already become the girl who believed it before anyone else did. We grew up slowly, the way children in small towns do, with the seasons instead of milestones. 14 turned to 16. 16 turned into stolen kisses behind the fish market on Sunday evenings, into notes passed in a language only we understood, half real words, half inside jokes about the fisherman who fell asleep at the harbor bar. By 17, we weren't hiding it anymore. Everyone in town called us the boy who would leave and the girl who would follow, and they said it with a kind of fondness, like it was already written somewhere and none of us had any say in it. I remember our first real fight, the summer we were 17. He'd been offered a trial with a youth academy in the capital, his first real chance, and instead of being happy for him, I panicked. I told him I didn't want him to go. It was the only time in our entire relationship I tried to hold him back, and I've never forgotten the look on his face when I said it. "You're the one who always believed in me," he said, hurt cutting through his voice. "Don't you dare become the reason I doubt myself now." I cried that whole night, ashamed of my own fear. The next morning, I packed his bag myself and walked him to the bus station, because I understood, even at 17, that loving someone sometimes means choosing their dream over your comfort. "I'll come back for you," he said, holding my face in his rough, calloused hands, the same hands that had once thrown a half-flat ball against my garden wall 1,000 times. "Whatever happens out there, you're the one constant. You're home." I believed him. God help me, I believed him completely, the way you believe the sky is blue, the way you believe the tide will always return. For 3 years, we made it work across the distance. Phone calls at midnight when the rates were cheapest. Letters when the signal failed in the academy's remote training complex. I finished my studies in accounting while he clawed his way up through youth leagues, reserve teams, lone spells in cold cities where nobody knew his name yet, where he slept in dormitories with 4 other boys and called me every night just to hear a voice from home. There was a stretch, when he was 18, where I almost lost him, not to another woman, not then, but to failure. He'd been benched for 6 straight months. A new coach didn't rate him. He called me one night, and for the first time since I'd known him, Raphael cried. "Maybe I'm not what they said I was," he whispered. "Maybe I should come home." I didn't let him. I stayed on that phone with him until 4 in the morning, reminding him of every goal he'd scored with newspaper stuffed in his boots, every mile he'd run until he was sick on the side of the road, every person who had ever doubted him and been wrong. "You don't get to quit on the dream I believed in before you did," I told him. "Not now. Not when it's hard. Especially not when it's hard." He didn't quit. 2 months later, a new scout watched him score 4 goals in a reserve match that was supposed to mean nothing, and within a month, his name was in the newspapers for the first time. Within 3 months, he had a contract that made his mother weep at the kitchen table, the same table where she used to apologize for not having enough food to share. And within 6 months of that, he asked me to marry him. I said yes on a rooftop overlooking a city that wasn't ours, under string lights he'd paid for with his very first real paycheck, lights he'd hung himself, badly, so that half of them blinked out of rhythm with the rest. "This is just the beginning," he whispered against my hair. "Everything I build for us." I want to pause here and tell you something important, because I think it matters more than anything else in this story. I was not a woman chasing fame. I never once asked him for the money, the houses, the cars that would come later. What I wanted, the only thing I ever truly wanted, was him. The boy on the seawall. The boy who cried on the phone at 18 and got back up anyway. The boy who believed dreams could be built out of nothing but hunger and stubbornness. But dreams, I would learn, have a cost. And sometimes the person who pays that cost isn't the dreamer. It's the one standing quietly beside him, holding the weight so he doesn't have to. We married in a small ceremony back in our hometown, before the world knew his name the way it soon would. My father, who had once said Raphael had holes in his shoes, stood up at the reception with tears in his eyes and said, "I was wrong about you, son. I've never seen a boy work harder for anything in my life." My mother cried through the entire ceremony. His mother cried harder, clutching my hands afterward and whispering, "Thank you for never letting go of him, even when we had nothing to offer you." I stood at that altar in a dress I'd altered myself, taken in at the waist because we couldn't afford a proper tailor, looking at a man who, in 4 years, would be worth more money than our entire town had seen in 100 years combined. I remember the honeymoon we couldn't really afford, a modest week in a coastal town 2 hours from home, staying in a guest house with a leaking tap and a view of the harbor instead of the sea. Raphael apologized for it constantly that whole week, promising me marble floors and private beaches one day. "I swear it, Elena." I told him, again and again, that I didn't need marble floors. I needed exactly what we had, a leaking tap, a narrow bed, and a man who still looked at me like I was the most extraordinary thing he'd ever found, more extraordinary than any trophy waiting for him somewhere down the road. He laughed and said I was the only person on earth who'd ever tell him less was enough. I believed, foolishly perhaps, that this was simply who he was, a boy who would always remember what enough felt like, because he'd spent so many years without it. I didn't know it then, but that wedding day was the last day I would ever feel like his equal. Because fame doesn't arrive all at once. It creeps in, quietly, disguised as opportunity. First it was the training camps that kept him away for months at a time, camps I couldn't visit because the club prefers players to focus. Then it was the sponsors, the photographers, the executives who filled his calendar with meetings I wasn't invited to, meetings that used to include me, back when we were poor enough that every decision was still ours together. Then it was a new club, the biggest one in the world, and a transfer fee so large it made international news, printed in bold across the front page of newspapers in countries I'd never even visited. I remember the day the transfer was announced. We were still living in our modest apartment from his first big contract, boxes half packed for the move already stacked against the wall. Raphael picked me up off the ground and spun me around the kitchen, laughing the way he used to laugh as a boy after scoring against older boys with better boots. "We did it," he kept saying, "we actually did it." I remember feeling, in that exact moment, closer to him than I had in years, as though the success wasn't something happening to him alone, but something we were still, genuinely, building together, the way we'd promised each other on that rooftop under crooked string lights. It would be nearly 2 years before I understood that this was the last time I would ever hear him say we about something that mattered and mean it the way he once had. And with that transfer came a new city, a new mansion with more bathrooms than our childhood homes had rooms, and a new circle of people who looked at me like I was something Raphael had brought with him from before he mattered. Before he was somebody. I remember the first gala we attended together after the transfer, a glittering room full of people whose names I didn't know and whose approval, apparently, mattered enormously. A journalist asked him, in front of cameras, "Raphael, tell us about the woman beside you." And he smiled that famous smile, the one the world would come to know from 1,000 billboards, and said, "She's been with me since before all this." My rock. His rock. Not his wife. Not his love. His rock, something solid, something silent, something you don't have to explain, only stand near. I laughed it off that night, told myself it was just a soundbite, that men who grew up poor sometimes forget how to talk about feelings in front of cameras. I told myself 100 small lies that year, because the alternative, admitting that the boy from the seawall was slowly disappearing into someone I didn't fully recognize, was too painful to face directly. But there were signs. Small ones, at first, the way cracks in a foundation start as hairlines you can paint over. He started taking calls in another room, closing the door gently, the way you close a door when you don't want to be rude, but also don't want to be heard. He started traveling for sponsorship meetings that had no names attached to them on the calendar we still, technically, shared. He started flinching, just slightly, almost imperceptibly, when I asked simple questions like, "Where were you tonight?" I remember one night in particular, maybe 8 months into the new contract, when he came home smelling faintly of perfume that wasn't mine. I asked him about it, and he laughed, actually laughed, and said, "Elena, I was at a photo shoot with 12 stylists standing 3 feet from me all day. It's probably one of theirs." It was such a reasonable answer that I believed it instantly, and I hated myself, just a little, for even having asked. And then there was her. Her name doesn't matter, not yet. What matters is that she appeared the way shadows do, quietly, at the edges of photographs, at the edges of my peripheral vision, at the edges of a life I still believed was entirely mine. I saw her first in the background of a magazine spread about Raphael's new era as a global brand ambassador, standing just behind his shoulder, her hand resting a little too long on his arm as she adjusted his collar for the camera. A stylist, they said. A brand consultant who worked closely with the club's biggest stars. I told myself it meant nothing. I told myself I trusted him, because I did. Because trust was the entire foundation of everything we built, from a half-flat ball against a garden wall to a mansion with more rooms than we could ever fill. I had trusted him through poverty, through 6 months of him doubting his own talent, through years of long-distance calls and cold dormitories. Why would I stop trusting him now, when everything he'd ever dreamed of had finally come true? But trust, I would soon learn, is the easiest thing in the world to exploit. Because the people who trust the most are the last ones to look for the cracks. There's one more memory I need to give you before I take you to Madrid, because I think it explains something about how betrayal like this survives so long without being seen. About a year before that night, an old friend from our hometown, Beatriz, came to visit us in the city. We'd grown up 3 houses apart. She'd known me since before I knew Raphael, and she'd known him almost as long. She stayed with us for 4 days, and on the last night, as we sat on the terrace with wine neither of us could have imagined affording a decade earlier, she looked at me for a long moment and said, quietly, "You seem tired, Elena." Not sleepy tired. Tired like you're holding something up. I laughed it off, told her it was just the pace of the new season, the travel, the demands of a life that never stopped moving. But she reached over and took my hand and said something I didn't understand then, something I would only understand fully much later. "I watched you two grow up. He used to look at you like the ball didn't matter at all when you were in the room. Does he still look at you like that?" I didn't answer her. I remember that specifically, I didn't answer, because some part of me already knew, and didn't want to say it out loud, not even to someone who had known us both since we were children throwing stones into the harbor. Beatriz left the next morning, and I hugged her a little longer than usual at the door, though I couldn't have told you why at the time. That night in Madrid, the night he became the richest footballer alive, the night his name was announced on every screen in every country, the night I should have been the proudest woman on earth, I found his phone charging on the bathroom counter while he was downstairs accepting a trophy the size of a small child, surrounded by flashing lights and a room full of people chanting his name. I wasn't looking for anything. I want you to understand that clearly. I picked it up only because my own phone had died in the chaos of the ceremony and I needed to call my mother, to tell her the news, to hear her cry with joy the way she always did whenever her boy, our boy, achieved something that should have been impossible for someone who once wore boots stuffed with newspaper. But the screen lit up with a message, and I read 4 words that ended the life I thought I was living. She still doesn't know. I stood there in that marble bathroom, in a dress that cost more than my parents' entire house, holding a phone that revealed everything I'd refused to see for 2 years. I remember the sensation exactly, a cold that started in my fingertips and moved up through my chest, slow and total, like ice water replacing my blood. My ears rang. The distant sound of applause from the ballroom below felt like it was coming from somewhere underwater. I scrolled, I know I shouldn't have, but grief doesn't ask permission, and found more. Messages going back months. A name I didn't recognize, saved simply as C. Photographs I will not describe, because some things, even in telling this story, I choose to keep for myself. Plans. An apartment. A rhythm of secrecy so practiced, so smooth, that it was clear this wasn't the first time, and it certainly wasn't going to be the last, unless something changed. And in that silence, that terrible, ringing silence, I understood something that would define the rest of this story. The boy who once told me I would stand beside him when he made it to the top had made it to the top. And somewhere along the way, on some Tuesday I never noticed, in some meeting I wasn't invited to, he had decided he didn't need me standing there at all, not really. Not the way he needed the cameras, the endorsements, the applause. I put the phone back exactly where I found it. I fixed my makeup in the mirror, my hands trembling in a way I willed myself to control. And I walked back downstairs, into a ballroom full of flashing cameras, and I smiled for photographs beside the man who had just, without even knowing it yet, shattered everything I thought I understood about my own life. But what I didn't know that night was this: the pain that broke me in that bathroom was only the beginning. Because betrayal, when it's big enough, doesn't just break your heart. It breaks your understanding of your entire history, every memory, every sacrifice, every year you thought you were building something real, together, brick by brick, from nothing. And it would take everything in me, every ounce of the same stubbornness I once admired in a boy on a seawall, to find out just how deep that betrayal actually went. I didn't confront him that night. I know what you're thinking, how could I stand there, holding proof, and say nothing? But grief doesn't always look like screaming. Sometimes it looks like a woman smoothing down her dress, walking back into a ballroom full of flashing cameras, and smiling for photographs beside the man who has just broken her, because the alternative is collapsing in front of the entire world, live, on every entertainment channel on the planet. I smiled that night. God forgive me, I smiled so well that not one journalist noticed anything was wrong. I stood beside Rafael as he lifted his trophy, as he thanked his rock in front of 1,000 cameras, and I clapped until my hands ached, because I needed time. I needed to understand what I was dealing with before I let him see that I knew. That's the thing nobody tells you about betrayal at this level, it isn't just personal. It's structural. It's protected by publicists, by lawyers, by an entire machine built to keep the Golden Boy's image untarnished. If I made one wrong move, one public scene, I wouldn't just lose my husband. I would lose my dignity, my privacy, and possibly my ability to ever be believed, because the world had already decided who Rafael was, humble, devoted, a man who never forgot where he came from. Nobody would believe that the boy from the fishing village could become a man who lied so easily, so smoothly, so completely. So I did the hardest thing I have ever done. I went home. I unpacked my bags in the enormous walk-in closet that still felt, somehow, borrowed. I hung my dress next to his tailored suits. And I began, quietly, to watch. For 3 weeks, I said nothing. I studied his patterns the way I imagine detectives study a case file, not out of coldness, but out of necessity. I noticed the new gym schedule that always fell on Tuesday and Thursday evenings, always at the same private facility across the city, always without his usual training staff, who I quietly confirmed, through a casual conversation with his fitness coordinator, had no idea what sessions he was referring to. I noticed the second phone, hidden in the lining of a gym bag I wasn't supposed to look through, a phone he'd once joked was just for burner numbers, athletes get weird requests. I noticed the way he'd stopped saying we when he talked about the future, and started saying I. Small cracks. But cracks, once you start seeing them, are impossible to unsee. I remember a dinner party during those 3 weeks, hosted by the club's ownership for the senior players and their families. I sat at a long table beneath crystal chandeliers, making polite conversation with wives and girlfriends I barely knew, when Camila arrived, professionally, as part of the brand team, seated at a nearby table with the marketing executives. I watched her that night with a kind of clinical attention I didn't know I was capable of. I watched the way she laughed a half-second too early at something Rafael said from across the room, before he'd even finished the joke, the way you laugh when you already know the punchline because you've heard it before, privately, somewhere else. I watched Rafael's eyes flick toward her table 3 times during dinner, quick, practiced, invisible to anyone who wasn't already looking for it. Beside me sat Marisol, the wife of Rafael's longtime teammate and closest friend on the squad. She was older than me by a decade, warm in a tired sort of way, the kind of woman who had clearly seen this world for what it was for a very long time. At one point, as dessert was served, she leaned toward me and said, quietly, almost gently, "You're stronger than you look, Elena. I hope you know that." I asked her what she meant. She just squeezed my hand under the table and said, "Nothing, sweetheart. Just, take care of yourself in this world. It isn't always kind to the ones who loved these men first." She wouldn't say more, no matter how I pressed, gently, over the following weeks. But I understood, even then, that she knew something. That perhaps everyone at that table, gliding smoothly through champagne and small talk, knew something I was only just beginning to uncover. Everyone knew. Except me. There is a particular kind of grief in discovering that your own life has been a performance for an audience that already knew the ending. I stopped sleeping properly. I stopped eating the way I should have. I would sit in our enormous, beautiful house, a house with an indoor pool and a private cinema and a garden bigger than the entire street I grew up on, and feel more alone than I had ever felt as a child with nothing. Because at least back then, I had the truth. I remember calling my mother one night during that period, unable to hold it together any longer, my voice cracking the moment she answered. "Something's wrong," I told her. "I think Raphael isn't who I thought he was." My mother, wise in the way only mothers who have survived hardship can be, was quiet for a long moment before she said, "Elena, listen to me. You didn't marry a stranger. You married a boy who used to be hungry. Sometimes, when men like that finally have everything, they forget what it cost the people who fed them along the way." I didn't fully understand her words that night. I would understand them completely, months later, when I finally saw the full shape of what Raphael had built behind my back. There was one evening, about a month into my quiet investigation, when I nearly confronted him. He came home late, again, smelling of a cologne I didn't recognize, and something in me simply broke open. I stood in our kitchen with my hands shaking, the words already forming, "I know, Raphael, I know about her, I know about the phone," when he looked up at me, exhausted, and said, "Rough day. The gaffer's on my back about form. Did you eat? I hate that we barely talk anymore." And something about the genuine, weary tenderness in his voice made the words die in my throat. I told myself I needed more proof before I said anything I couldn't take back. I told myself I was being smart, not scared. Looking back, I think it was both. Because it wasn't just an affair. That, as devastating as it was, would have almost been simpler to survive, painful as that sounds. What I uncovered, piece by piece, over the following months, was something far larger, something that made the messages on his phone look small by comparison. It started with a folder I found in his home office on a rainy Sunday when he was away at a training camp, hidden behind tax documents I wasn't technically supposed to see, but which, as his legal wife, I had every right to. Inside were records of a private investment company, one I had never heard of, despite handling much of our household finances myself since I was the one with the accounting degree, the one who understood spreadsheets and contracts better than he ever would, the one who used to sit at our kitchen table in our first tiny apartment, calculating exactly how far his modest early salary could stretch. The company was registered in Camila's name. Over 18 months, Raphael had been quietly funneling a portion of his sponsorship earnings, not our joint assets, but new deals, new endorsements he'd signed without telling me, into an account structured entirely outside our marriage. Cars I'd never seen. Property records for a location I didn't recognize. And, buried in the file, the lease for a separate apartment in the city center that I had never once set foot in, paid for monthly, quietly, from an account I had never known existed. He wasn't just betraying me emotionally. He was building an entire second life, financially insulated from me, in case I would later understand this was the real reason, in case our marriage ever ended, and I came asking for what I was legally owed after 11 years of building his career alongside him, from nothing to everything. I sat on the floor of that office for hours, documents spread around me like broken glass, sunlight moving slowly across the walls until it was gone entirely and I was sitting in the dark. And I felt something shift inside me. It wasn't hope. It wasn't even anger, not yet. It was clarity, cold, sharp clarity, the kind that only comes when grief has nowhere left to hide. I thought about the boy on the seawall who told me dreams could be built from nothing but hunger and stubbornness. I thought about the girl who believed him, who packed his bag at 17, who stayed on the phone until 4 in the morning when he wanted to quit at 18. And I thought about the promise he made me at that bus station, "You're the one constant. You're home." He had lied to me about so many things by that point. But that lie, that one, was the one that broke something permanent in me. Because I finally understood that somewhere between the fishing village and the billion-dollar contract, Raphael had stopped seeing me as home. He had started seeing me as the past. A chapter closed, even if he hadn't found the courage, or the cruelty, to say so out loud yet. In the weeks that followed, piecing together old messages I could legally access, I began to understand how it had actually started, not as some sudden collapse of character, but as something that crept in slowly, almost politely, the way most betrayals do. Camila had joined the brand team 18 months after the big transfer, brought in to manage Rafael's growing portfolio of endorsements. The earliest messages between them were entirely professional: scheduling, contract details, approvals for photoshoots. I found myself reading them almost clinically, searching for the exact moment the tone shifted, the way you search a crime scene for the first sign of forced entry. It happened, as far as I could tell, during a difficult stretch in his second season at the new club, a slump in form, harsh criticism from pundits who said the transfer fee had been a mistake, whispers in the press that the pressure was finally breaking him. I remembered that period myself, from the outside, Rafael coming home tense, quiet, snapping at small things that never used to bother him. I had tried to comfort him the way I always had, reminding him of the boy who ran until he was sick on the side of the road and got back up anyway. But apparently, somewhere in that same stretch, Camila had also been offering comfort, texts late at night reassuring him the criticism was unfair, that the club didn't understand his true value, that she, unlike everyone else, truly saw what he was capable of. I read one message from her, dated during that slump, that stayed with me for a long time afterward: "You don't have to be perfect with me. I know how much you're carrying." I remember sitting with that sentence and feeling something horrible settle in my stomach, because it was, almost word for word, a version of things I myself had said to him on the phone when he was 18 and wanted to quit. She hadn't invented a new kind of comfort. She had simply offered a version of the same comfort I had always given him, at a moment when I wasn't there to give it, because I was 3 cities away, managing a household and a public image and a life that had grown too large for one person to hold alone. I don't say this to excuse what either of them did. I say it because I think it matters. Betrayal rarely looks like a single dramatic choice. It looks like a slow substitution, one small kindness at a time, until one day the person you built your whole life around has quietly rebuilt his emotional home somewhere else, brick by brick, the exact way we once built ours. I could have collapsed there, on that office floor, in the dark. Many women do, and I want to say clearly, there is no shame in that. Betrayal at this scale is not a small wound. It is a wound that reaches into your identity, your history, your sense of what was ever real. For weeks afterward, I barely functioned. I smiled for cameras I no longer trusted. I attended events beside a man whose hand I could no longer hold without feeling sick. I performed a marriage that, in every way that mattered, was already over, while the world continued to celebrate him as the humble boy who made good. But something my mother said kept returning to me, over and over, like a tide that refuses to stop reaching the shore: "You didn't marry a stranger." She was right. I hadn't married a stranger. I had married a boy I knew better than anyone else on this earth, his fears, his weaknesses, his blind spots, the exact way he underestimated the people he thought were too soft, too devoted, too in love to ever fight back. And that, I realized, sitting on that office floor with the evidence of his double life spread around me, was about to become his greatest mistake. Because I wasn't going to scream. I wasn't going to collapse in front of the cameras and hand the world a story about a hysterical, humiliated wife, a story his publicists could spin into sympathy for him within a news cycle. I was going to do what I had always done best, quietly, in the background, while everyone assumed I was simply the rock standing beside him, decorative and silent. I was going to build a case. I spent the next several weeks transforming my grief into precision. I reached out, discreetly, to an old university friend who had gone into forensic accounting, someone with no connection whatsoever to Rafael's world, someone bound by professional confidentiality the moment I hired her formally through a lawyer. I gathered every document I could legally access as his spouse's bank statements, property records, old emails from our shared family cloud account that we'd set up years earlier, before the fame, back when we still shared everything down to grocery lists and photographs from our honeymoon. I learned, slowly and methodically, the full architecture of what he had built, the shell company, the properties, the earnings he had deliberately structured to look like they belonged to someone else entirely. I learned the timeline, when the company was formed, when Camila's name was added to the paperwork, when the apartment lease began. I also learned something else during those weeks, something that made my resolve harden into something unbreakable. Camila wasn't the first. She was simply the one who had lasted longest, the one he had trusted enough to help hide the money. Buried in old messages, I found traces of others before her, quieter, shorter, easier to erase, each one coinciding almost perfectly with a new milestone in his career. A new contract. A new club. A new level of fame that made him feel, apparently, entitled to a life I had no part in. I confronted this truth alone, mostly at night, when the house was silent and the staff had gone home and Raphael himself was traveling, again, for reasons I no longer fully believed. I would sit with a cup of tea gone cold in my hands and simply breathe through the waves of grief that came unpredictably, sometimes triggered by nothing more than a photograph on the wall from our wedding, or the sound of a football being kicked somewhere outside, echoing faintly like a memory refusing to let go. There was one night, worse than the others, when the grief became too large for the house to hold. I called Beatriz, the friend who had asked me on that terrace a year earlier whether he still looked at me the way he used to. I didn't tell her everything, I couldn't yet, the words still felt too dangerous to say aloud, as though speaking them might make them permanently, unchangeably true. But I told her enough. I told her I thought Raphael was keeping something from me, something bigger than I could face alone. She was quiet for a long moment on the other end of the line, and then she said, gently, Elena, do you remember when we were 15, and you broke your ankle jumping off the harbor wall on a dare, and you walked yourself to the clinic instead of waiting for someone to carry you, because you didn't want to be a burden? I remembered. I told her I did. You've always done that, she said. Carried things yourself instead of asking anyone to help. I think that's what's happening now. I think you already know something is very wrong, and instead of asking for help, you're quietly walking yourself to the clinic on a broken ankle. Let someone carry this with you, this time. I cried on the phone with her for almost an hour that night, the first time I had let myself fully break since the message on Raphael's phone in Madrid. It didn't fix anything. But it reminded me that I wasn't entirely alone in the world, even if I was alone in that enormous house with its indoor pool and its private cinema and its silence. The following week, I made myself attend a charity gala I had been dreading, one of dozens Raphael and I were expected to appear at together, smiling for photographers, shaking hands with people whose names I'd stopped bothering to remember. I almost didn't go. But Isabel, whom I hadn't yet formally hired but had already begun quietly consulting through a mutual contact, had advised me, carefully, not to change my public behavior in any way that might tip Raphael off before I was ready. Keep living exactly the life you were living, she told me. Let him believe nothing has changed. That's how you protect yourself until you have everything you need. So I went. I wore a gown that made the photographers call my name, I laughed at the right moments, I let Raphael rest his hand on the small of my back for the cameras, and the entire time, some cold, observant part of me was cataloging every small betrayal in his behavior. The way his eyes found Camila's table before they found mine when we walked in, the way he excused himself twice during dinner for calls he said were the club, don't worry about it, the way he came back from the second call adjusting his collar in a gesture I now recognized, sickly, from that magazine photograph months earlier. I smiled through all of it. And I went home that night and wrote everything down in a notebook I kept hidden in a box of old letters from our courtship, dates, times, small inconsistencies, because I understood, even then, that memory fades and grief distorts, but a written record does not. I want to be honest with you about the moment my heartbreak began to turn into strength, because I think it matters more than the revenge itself. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday evening, the same evening he always claimed to be at his private training session. I sat in our kitchen, the kitchen with marble counters and appliances I had never once needed to use because we had staff for everything, and I looked at a photograph from our wedding day, still sitting in a silver frame on the shelf. Me in my altered dress. Him in a suit that didn't quite fit, because we still couldn't afford a proper tailor. Both of us laughing at something just out of frame. And instead of crying, for the first time in months, I felt calm. I realized something in that moment that changed the entire trajectory of what came next. Raphael had spent his whole life being underestimated, by scouts who overlooked him, by coaches who doubted a poor boy from a fishing town, by a world that never believed he'd amount to anything. And he had used every single one of those doubts as fuel to prove people wrong, running until he was sick, training in boots stuffed with newspaper, staying on the phone until 4 a.m. fighting to keep his own dream alive. He had simply never imagined that the person he'd underestimate one day would be me. He had never once considered that the quiet girl who packed his bags and believed in him before anyone else did might have exactly the same stubbornness running through her own blood. But what I didn't know that Tuesday evening was just how far his betrayal actually reached, because the shell company, the hidden apartment, the second life with Camila, were not even the deepest secret he was keeping. There was one more layer, one more room in the house of lies he had built, and when I finally found it, it would not just end our marriage. It would end everything he had spent his whole life building. I found the last piece of the truth by accident, the way the most important discoveries in life often happen. I was going through old emails on our shared family cloud account, the one Raphael had set up years earlier, before the fame, before the fortune, searching for a photograph from our honeymoon that I suddenly, desperately, needed to look at, as though proof of a time when things were simple could somehow anchor me. Buried in an old, forgotten folder from 4 years prior, before Camila, before the shell company, I found a message thread between Raphael and his agent that made my blood run cold. It wasn't about an affair. It was about me. In the earliest days of his career explosion, right after the transfer that made him a household name, his agent had drafted a private risk management plan. A plan that discussed, in cold legal language, how to protect Raphael's growing fortune in the event the marriage becomes a liability. The email outlined strategies to minimize what I would be entitled to if we ever divorced, transferring assets into separate entities, delaying joint ownership on new properties, structuring endorsement deals so the income technically never became marital property under the laws of the countries where he was signing contracts. Raphael had approved every single recommendation. His reply, 3 lines long, sent from an airport lounge 4 years earlier, read simply, "Makes sense. Let's set it up quietly. No need to involve E in the details, she doesn't need to worry about this stuff. She doesn't need to worry about this stuff." I sat with that email for a long time, rereading it until the words stopped making sense and then snapped back into painful clarity. This wasn't a man who had simply fallen out of love and made a mistake with someone named Camila. This was a man who, from nearly the very beginning of his success, had been quietly planning for a future where I would be discarded, and made sure, legally and financially, that when that day came, I would walk away with almost nothing, despite 11 years of building the very career that made him a billionaire. I thought about every sacrifice. Every semester of my own education I postponed so I could move to a new city for his contract. Every friendship I lost because we relocated 4 times in 6 years. Every ounce of my own identity I folded quietly into his so there would be room for his dream to grow. I thought about staying on the phone until 4 a.m. when he wanted to quit. I thought about the newspaper stuffed in his boots, and the extra plate my mother set at our table without a word. And I understood, with a grief so total it left me hollow for days, that all of it, every piece of myself I had given, had been calculated, from almost the beginning, as an acceptable loss on a balance sheet I never knew existed. But grief, I had already learned, has a shelf life. And mine, finally, had run out. I want to tell you what I did next, not because I want applause, but because I think every woman who has ever been underestimated by someone who claimed to love her deserves to hear that quiet, careful strength can be more powerful than rage. I didn't leak anything to the press. I didn't smash a single window or throw a single plate, though God knows there were nights I wanted to. Instead, I did what Raphael had never expected the rock beside him to be capable of. I built an airtight legal case, piece by piece, with the same discipline he had once used to run suicide sprints on a beach until he collapsed. I hired a lawyer, a sharp, formidable woman named Isabel, who had represented spouses in cases far larger than mine, who listened to my entire story over 3 hours in her office without a single interruption, and who, at the end, closed her folder and said, "Elena, I want you to understand something. What he did isn't just a betrayal. Legally, it's fraud against marital assets. And we are going to prove every single piece of it." For the first time in months, I felt something other than grief. I felt the ground steady beneath me. The forensic accounting process itself took nearly 4 months, longer than I ever expected when I first sat down with my old university friend, Renata, who had gone on to specialize in exactly this kind of hidden asset investigation. We met, at first, in coffee shops far from anywhere Raphael's circle might recognize me, exchanging flash drives instead of gossip, the way I imagine spies must feel meeting handlers in unfamiliar cities. Renata was patient in a way I desperately needed during those months. She never once made me feel foolish for not noticing sooner, never once suggested I should have caught it earlier. "These structures are built specifically to be missed," she told me once, spreading a web of company names and transaction dates across her kitchen table. Shell companies, layered accounts, assets rotated through jurisdictions with different disclosure laws. This isn't something a loving, trusting spouse is supposed to catch. This is something designed, from the start, to survive a marriage falling apart without anyone noticing until it's too late to claim what's fairly yours. Hearing her say it so plainly, designed, from the start, was its own kind of grief, separate from the affair, separate from Camila entirely. It was the grief of understanding that somewhere, in an office I'd never seen, lawyers had sat around a table calculating my eventual irrelevance while I was 3 cities away, learning a new grocery store's layout for the 4th time in 6 years, believing every relocation was something we were building together. Renata's final report, when it came, ran nearly 80 pages. Reading it in one sitting, alone at my kitchen table at midnight, was one of the hardest things I have ever done, not because the information was new to me by then, but because seeing it laid out so completely, so undeniably, made it impossible to ever again wonder if I had simply misunderstood, overreacted, imagined a betrayal that wasn't really there. Some part of me, even after everything, had still been holding on to a small, quiet hope that I was wrong. Renata's report closed that door for good. Isabel and my forensic accountant friend worked for weeks reviewing everything: the shell company documents, the hidden apartment records, the risk management email trail approved and signed off by Raphael himself, and, yes, the messages with Camila that had started my search in the first place. What we built wasn't just a divorce filing. It was a financial reckoning that would expose, in painstaking legal detail, exactly how a humble boy from a fishing village had spent nearly a decade deliberately hiding assets from the woman who had helped build his empire from nothing. There was a moment, near the end of that process, when I almost lost my nerve. Raphael's mother called me one evening, a call I almost didn't answer, and I braced myself for defense, for excuses, for the familiar plea to think of the family, the image, the years we'd shared. Instead, her voice broke almost immediately. "Elena," she said, "I don't know everything, but I know enough. I am so ashamed of what my son has become. You fed him when we had nothing. You believed in him when the whole world doubted him. Whatever you decide to do, I understand. I only ask that you know, not everyone in this family has forgotten what you did for us." I cried after that call, but for the first time in a long while, they weren't tears of grief. They were tears of being seen, finally, by someone who mattered. I filed for divorce on a Thursday morning, quietly, through Isabel's office, with no warning, no dramatic confrontation, no scene for cameras to capture. Raphael found out the same way the rest of the world eventually would, through documents, cold and undeniable, that laid out everything: the affair, the hidden company, the calculated plan to protect his fortune at my expense. He called me 11 times that day. I didn't answer a single one. Each missed call sat on my screen like a small, quiet victory. When he finally showed up at the house, 3 days later, He looked like a man who had aged a decade in 72 hours. Gone was the polished, camera-ready confidence the world knew so well. In its place was something almost unrecognizable, panic, raw and unfiltered, the same panic, I imagine, of a boy realizing the ball he's been chasing his whole life has finally rolled somewhere he cannot reach. "Elena, please," he said, standing in the doorway of the home we had built together, the home he had apparently always intended to keep entirely his own. "We can fix this. Whatever you think you found, we can talk about it. I never stopped loving you. Camila, that's over, I promise you, it's been over for weeks." "This isn't about Camila," I said quietly, and I watched something in his face genuinely falter, as though he had prepared an entire defense for the wrong trial. "This is about an email from 4 years ago, Raphael. 4 years. Before her. Before any of this. You and your agent, deciding what I deserved after everything, while I was still learning your new team's training schedule so I could plan our life around it." He didn't have an answer. For the first time in 11 years, the boy who always had something to say, some promise, some dream, some reassurance whispered under string lights, stood in front of me completely silent. "You didn't just betray me with her," I continued, my voice steadier than I expected it to be. "You planned to betray me from the very beginning of everything good that happened to you. You let me believe I was building something with you, while your lawyers were finding ways to make sure I'd have nothing to show for it. That's not love, Raphael. That's a business decision. And I refuse to be collateral damage in your empire." He reached for my hand, and I stepped back, not out of cruelty, but out of a kind of self-preservation I had never needed before in my life. "I'm sorry," he said, and I believed, in that moment, that he probably was sorry for being caught, sorry for the consequences now arriving at his door, sorry in the particular way people are sorry when the cost of their choices finally comes due. But sorry, I had learned, doesn't undo a decade of quiet architecture built specifically to leave you with nothing. The legal battle that followed was long, and it became public, though not in the way either of us initially expected. Because I had done my work so thoroughly, so quietly, so completely without emotion clouding the details, that when the documents became part of the court record, the shell company, the risk management plan explicitly designed to minimize a spouse's rightful claim, the affair that had lasted well over a year, the pattern of others before it, the story that broke wasn't the one Raphael's publicists had spent a decade building. I remember sitting in the deposition room, across a long table from lawyers I'd never met, answering questions about our life together with a calm I didn't know I still had access to. At one point, Raphael's own lawyer, trying to paint me as bitter, asked, "Isn't it true, Mrs., that you benefited enormously from your husband's success throughout your marriage?" "Yes," I said. "I also built it. I moved 4 times in 6 years for his career. I postponed my own education twice. I sat in cold stadiums in 3 countries, alone, so he would have one familiar face in the crowd. I answered fan mail at 2 in the morning because his team was understaffed. I was not a passenger in his success. I was one of its architects. The only difference between us is that I never once tried to make sure he'd end up with nothing if things fell apart." The room was silent after that. Isabel told me later it was the moment she knew we would win. There was another moment during that process I still think about often, though it never made it into any headline. Midway through negotiations, Raphael requested a private meeting, without lawyers, just the 2 of us, in a neutral hotel restaurant far from both our homes. Against Isabel's cautious advice, I agreed, because some part of me, the part that had known him since he was a boy with newspaper in his boots, needed to look at him one more time without cameras, without documents, without anyone else in the room. He looked older than his years that day, the exhaustion of the past months etched into his face in a way no amount of money could smooth over. We sat across from each other for a long time before either of us spoke. "Do you remember the seawall?" he finally asked, quietly. "I remember everything," I said. "That's the problem, Raphael. I remember every single thing, which is exactly how I know how far you traveled from the boy who used to sit there." He was quiet for a moment, turning his water glass slowly on the table. I told myself I was protecting what we built, he said. That's what the lawyers called it. Protection. I didn't think of it as taking anything away from you. I think, somewhere along the way, I stopped being able to tell the difference between protecting my career and protecting us. I'm not asking you to forgive that. I don't think I'd forgive it either, if our places were switched. It was, I think, the closest thing to an honest reckoning I ever got from him, not an excuse, not quite an apology either, but an admission that something in him had genuinely lost its way, without any grand villain moment to explain it, just a slow accumulation of choices that each seemed small and reasonable at the time. I didn't forgive him that afternoon. I'm not sure forgiveness was ever really the point. But I left that restaurant feeling, for the first time since Madrid, that I finally understood not just what he had done, but somewhat how a person becomes capable of doing it, one small, protected decision at a time, until protection curdles into betrayal without the person doing it ever quite noticing the exact moment it happened. I remember the day the story first broke publicly, not through any leak of mine, but through a routine court filing that a sports journalist happened to notice while covering an unrelated transfer story. Within hours, my phone would not stop ringing, reporters, old friends I hadn't spoken to in years, even a few of Rafael's teammates' wives, some cautious, some openly supportive. Marisol, the woman who had squeezed my hand under the table at that first dinner party and told me I was stronger than I looked, called and simply said, "I'm proud of you." I should have said more, sooner. I'm sorry I didn't. I didn't give a single interview during those first turbulent weeks. Isabel had advised strongly against it, and for once, I didn't need convincing. Let the documents speak, she said. Documents don't have emotions for people to twist. Your face on a television screen, however composed, gives them something to pick apart. Numbers and dates don't blink. So I stayed silent, and the paperwork spoke for me, cold, precise, undeniable, while Rafael's team scrambled to control a narrative that no longer belonged entirely to them. It wasn't the story of a humble boy who never forgot where he came from. It was the story of a man who had used the very love and loyalty of the woman who stood beside him through poverty and struggle as a stepping stone, and then quietly, calculatedly, tried to erase her from the fortune she helped him build. Sponsors began distancing themselves, not because of the affair alone. Infidelity, sadly, rarely costs these men what it should, but because of the calculated, documented plan to defraud a spouse of assets built during the marriage. That kind of story doesn't just damage a reputation. It damages trust, and trust, as I had learned the hard way, is the one currency that even billionaires cannot simply buy back with another trophy, another goal, another smile for the cameras. I want to be clear about something, because I think it matters more than the outcome of any lawsuit. I did not do any of this for revenge in the way people usually imagine it. I never wanted to destroy Rafael. I never celebrated his downfall the way the tabloids seemed to, with their cruel headlines and speculative gossip. What I wanted, what I fought for, month after exhausting month, was simply the truth to be known, and for 11 years of my own life, my own sacrifices, my own quiet labor, to finally be seen. The settlement, when it came, reflected exactly that. Not vengeance. Fairness. A fair and legally recognized share of the fortune we had built together, from a boy with newspaper stuffed in his boots to the wealthiest athlete alive. Not because I wanted his money, but because I refused, after everything, to let the world believe I had contributed nothing. Camila, I later learned through mutual acquaintances, left him within the year, not long after the court documents became public and the sponsors began quietly walking away. It turns out a man who is willing to build an entire architecture of betrayal against the woman who raised him from nothing will eventually, inevitably, do the same to anyone standing beside him. Trust, once a man learns to treat it as an obstacle to route around rather than a bond to honor, doesn't discriminate about who it fails next. As for Rafael, his career continued, because the world, unfortunately, still measures men by their trophies and not always by their character. But something had changed, permanently, in how he was seen. The image of the humble boy who never forgot his roots was gone, replaced by a more complicated truth that no publicist could fully erase, a man who had planned, with cold precision, to discard the person who loved him first, before anyone else in the world believed he was worth loving at all. I moved back, eventually, to a smaller home near the sea, not our exact hometown. The memories there were still too complicated for daily living, but close enough to hear the same kind of waves I grew up with, close enough that some evenings I could almost hear a half-flat ball thudding against a garden wall if I let myself remember. I finished the parts of my accounting career I had postponed for him all those years ago, and I built something that belonged entirely to me, a small financial consultancy helping women navigate exactly the kind of hidden asset battles I had once faced completely alone, in the dark, on an office floor surrounded by documents that had rewritten my entire understanding of my own marriage. I think about the girl on the seawall sometimes, the one who believed a boy's dreams could be built from nothing but hunger and stubbornness. I don't regret loving him. I don't regret the sacrifices I made when I believed, truly believed, that we were building a life together, brick by brick, promise by promise. Because that love was real, at least for a while, even if it was eventually buried under something far less honest than the boy who first earned it. What I regret is how long it took me to understand a truth I now carry with me every single day. Love should never require you to disappear so someone else can shine. And loyalty, real loyalty, is never one-sided. It either grows in both directions, matching effort for effort, sacrifice for sacrifice, or it isn't loyalty at all. It's just a story one person is telling, while the other quietly pays the price for believing it. My mother was right, in the end, about more than she probably realized when she said it. I hadn't married a stranger. But somewhere along the way, hunger had taught Raphael a lesson I wish it hadn't, that things, once gained, must be protected at any cost, even the cost of the person who taught him what having something worth protecting even felt like. If there's one thing I want you to take from my story, it's this: the people who underestimate you, the ones who believe your silence means weakness, your patience means blindness, your love means you'll never fight back, are almost always the ones who end up most surprised by exactly how strong you become, once you finally stop shrinking to make room for someone else's fortune. I am not the rock anymore. I am not the quiet woman standing just outside the camera's frame, smiling for a life I didn't fully own, believing a promise made under string lights that half blinked out of rhythm. I am simply Elena. And for the first time since I was a girl on that seawall, watching a boy chase a dream that would one day try to leave me behind, everything I have, every piece of it, is entirely, honestly, mine. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, women who found my consultancy through a friend of a friend sit across from me at my small office by the sea, holding folders of their own, bank statements, property records, the beginnings of questions they're almost afraid to ask out loud. I recognize the look in their eyes immediately, because I once wore it myself, sitting on an office floor in the dark, surrounded by documents that rewrote everything I thought I understood about my own life. I tell them what I wish someone had told me sooner, that the quiet, patient love you gave so freely was never foolish, even if it was, in the end, not honored the way it deserved to be. That noticing the cracks doesn't mean you were blind before, it means you were finally ready to see clearly. And that the same strength it takes to stay, to sacrifice, to believe in someone before the world does, is exactly the strength it takes to walk away and rebuild an entire life from nothing, when nothing is what you're left with. Beatrice visits every summer now, and we sit on my terrace with wine we can finally, comfortably afford, and sometimes we talk about the girl who broke her ankle jumping off the harbor wall and walked herself to the clinic rather than ask for help. I tell her I don't do that anymore. I ask for help now, freely, without shame, because I learned the hard way what happens when you carry everything alone for too long. My father, before he passed, told me once that he'd been wrong about many things in his life, but never more grateful to be wrong than about the boy with holes in his shoes. I was wrong that he had nothing to offer, he said. He offered you the hardest lesson a person can learn, how to know your own worth, even after someone spends a decade trying to convince you otherwise. I think about those words often, especially on the evenings when the sea is loud enough to remind me of home, the real home, the one I built myself, out of nothing but hunger and stubbornness, exactly the way I once believed a boy from nowhere could build a dream. If you are somewhere in the middle of your own version of this story right now, still smiling in photographs you no longer trust, still explaining away perfume that isn't yours, still telling yourself you're being paranoid, I want you to hear this clearly. From someone who has already walked the entire length of that road, you are not paranoid. You are perceptive. And the same quiet strength that let you love so completely is the exact strength that will carry you through discovering the truth, however long it takes, and however far it reaches. Love, real love, should never cost you your own name.